I was born with a curiosity to explore the realms of darkness, to seek out the elusive shadows and question their existence, their never-ending convolution with the light. All things were born from this darkness.
Squirrel Cage Jail, Council Bluffs, Iowa. The Squirrel Cage Jail was built in 1885 to house City Bluffs' most unruly citizens. It was built where the former morgue of St. Paul's Episcopal Church once held the bodies of the dead. The construction is one of a kind, as it is the only 3-story rotary jail ever built. Rotary jails were built to maximize security using only one jailer. The Squirrel Cage Jail consists of 3 circular stories that rotate on an axis. The floors, each containing 10 pie-shaped cells, are covered by a cylindrical cage, and there was only one opening, meaning that only one prisoner could be accessed at a time. To operate the rotating floors, the jailer would turn a crank that would rotate the prison cells. But what at first appeared to be a brilliant and efficient design soon turned into a failure. Almost immediately after opening, the jail began showing signs of its flawed design. Because of its shape and function, the rotating jail was considered a fire hazard. If a fire ever broke out, the cylindrical design of the cage would act as a furnace, spreading and increasing the fire, burning all prisoners alive. Not only that, but inmates were having their limbs crushed when the cells rotated. Limbs were mangled and ripped apart by the metal cage bars. Heads were crushed and sometimes decapitated. As the years progressed, the axis all the cells rotated around began to sink into the unstable soil and shift, causing the cells to get stuck and prisoners trapped without food or water. Furthermore, the rotating jail was banned from rotating after an inmate had a heart attack. When the prison guard went to retrieve the inmate to get him help, the rotary had malfunctioned. The inmate's dead body lay in his cell for 2 days before the mechanism was fixed and he was able to be retrieved. Conditions in the cells were unbearable. Because of the design, the cacophony of voices would carry and reverberate around the cylindrical drum, amplifying and carrying even the smallest noises. Many prisoners said the noise alone was enough to make a man go mad. Since the jail was operated by one man, the 4th floor held the living area for the jailer so he could always keep watch over the inmates. The apartment was quaint but homely, and was large enough to house the jailer, his wife, and their children. On many occasions, the jailer's wife and kids would refuse to live on the 4th floor, claiming it was haunted. In the 1950s, jailer Bill Foster refused to stay or even go onto the 4th floor after hearing strange noises and footsteps. Instead, he opted to live on the 2nd-story prisoner level to avoid the, quote, strange goings-on up there, unquote. The Squirrel Cage Jail closed in 1969 and is now a museum. Since its closing, people have been reporting paranormal activity. The once cacophonous echoes of the past have been silenced, leaving only a quiet emptiness, and in this quiet space, unexplainable voices are heard. People have felt something pulling on their clothes, whisper in their ear. Some have been violently shoved. Doors open and close on their own, and multiple apparitions have been seen by staff and guests. One of the apparitions, strangely enough, is that of a little girl. She has been seen multiple times throughout the prison. She has even been seen trapped inside one of the cells with no way in or no way out. The jail was built long before roads were even paved. Back in those days, child services were not a thing, and oftentimes, if you were arrested and you had children, your children would be locked up until someone came to claim them. Although it's unclear whether this child was the jailer's daughter or a former inmate, one thing is certain. The ghost of a little girl has been seen, felt, and heard, and is one of many ghosts that haunt the Squirrel Cage Jail. Green Mountain Train Wreck, Green Mountain, Iowa. On the morning of March 21, 1910, the St. Louis train line number 21 and the Chicago train line number 19 were combined to divert traffic after a wreck on a different track happened earlier in the day. The train, traveling at 25 miles per hour and carrying multiple passengers, suddenly derailed, causing the train to telescope in on itself. Usually the wooden cars were placed together away from the heavier cars, but due to the hastily planned conjoining, the wooden cars were sandwiched between the much heavier steel cars. At the moment of impact, the wooden train cars were instantly crushed along with anything inside. A survivor sitting on the back of one of the train cars wrote of the incident, quote, "The first thing I knew, the adjoining car came right back through ours. 2 men in front of us were crushed to death, and I and my companion were down on the bottom with what seemed like the world piled on top of us. We were sitting in a double seat. A man sat facing us. He and the seat came crashing back on us and flattened us to the floor. There we lay under a living man and 2 dead men who were literally smashed and whose blood ran down on us through the wreckage." Unquote. Another witness shared their account. Quote, "Women were pinned between the walls of the 2 cars, their heads protruding from the broken edges. Many of these were still living, some of them having strength enough only to gasp, while others moaned. Blood flowed everywhere, sprinkling down upon those who were pinned under the seats. The sight was so horrible that many of those who were not injured fainted from horror. The women screamed, the men moaned, and from the outside came the excited cries of those who came from the 10 coaches that escaped the wreck. Axes and crowbars were brought, and 100 men were working passionately, tearing up the wood in order to relieve the sufferers." Unquote. A young man who escaped the wreckage said, quote, "I saw a woman taken out with her little girl, both crushed to death. The mother had folded the child in her arms in an effort to protect her, and they were taken out dead, wrapped in each other's arms. I saw other women in the coach crushed into a bleeding mass, their heads hanging down, their hair matted with blood, their bodies twisted out of human shape. I have seen what I shall see all my life when I dream." Unquote. A newspaper article recalled the aftermath. Many passengers were killed outright, but the suffering among the injured was terrible. Arms and legs were cut off. The wreckage was almost crimson with blood, some of the bodies being crushed beyond recognition by the masses of twisted rails and splintered cars. A few of the passengers were found still living, with a rod or a splinter impaling them in the wreck. Decapitated bodies were found, and it was almost impossible to assort the dismembered parts. Although the railroad was removed and has since become farmland, the sounds of phantom trains are still heard along with disembodied screams. Apparitions of the victims are said to roam the area. In the aftermath of the horrific accident, 52 people lost their lives and another 39 were injured, most of which were women and children. To this day, we still don't know what caused the horrific train crash that took the lives of 52 people, but those whom were present are still haunted by what they saw that tragic morning. The day that music died. Clear Lake, Iowa. It was a cold night on February 3rd, 1959. Backstage at the Surf Ballroom, 3 of the biggest acts had just finished performing and was discussing their next gig. The tour had proven difficult, and the hardships they endured on their travels was becoming overwhelming. Buddy Holly, along with Richie Valens and the Big Bopper J.P. Richardson, had been traveling the Midwest on the Winter Dance Party Tour. The tour had problems from the beginning. The winter of 1959 was unbearable, dubbed one of the deadliest winters the Midwest had seen in decades. The tour buses were old, refurbished school buses that were deemed unsafe for children and did not have heating. The ride was miserable. Drummer Carl Bunch had to be treated for frostbite of both feet after one of the buses broke down during a snowstorm. Within the first 11 days of tour, they had gone through 5 different buses, all with mechanical problems. The tour would soon be referred to as the Tour from Hell by those involved. But things were about to get much, much worse. Buddy Holly, tired of the constant misfortunes they had experienced, decided to charter a plane to their next gig, but there were only 3 available seats. Although terrified of flying, Richie Valens wanted a seat on that plane to escape the harsh and freezing 365-mile bus ride. Valens and Holly's guitarist, Tommy Alsop, decided to let their fate ride on the outcome of a coin toss. Richie Valens won, exclaiming, quote, "That's the first time I've ever won anything in my life." Unquote. The Big Bopper, J.P. Richardson, was immediately given one of the seats because he had contracted the flu and could use the rest. Waylon Jennings, who played bass for Holly's band, the Crickets, originally was given the seat, but he gave up the spot for the sick J.P. Richardson. When Holly learned Jennings had given up his seat, he joked, "Well, I hope your old bus freezes up." Jennings responded with the words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "Well, I hope your old plane crashes." At 12:55 a.m., the plane took off during a light snowstorm. The airport control tower watched as the lights of the plane disappeared into the darkness. The pilot, 21-year-old Roger Peterson, had built his life around flying, but he was inexperienced and lacked the knowledge needed to safely transport passengers on a plane in the weather conditions they were flying in. By 1 a.m., Peterson had not made the scheduled radio contact. After multiple failed attempts to reach the pilot, a search plane was sent out in search of them. At 9:35 a.m., and less than 6 miles from their initial takeoff point, they spotted the wreckage of the plane in a cornfield. They had crashed shortly after takeoff. Buddy Holly, Richie Valens, J.P. Richardson, and 21-year-old pilot Roger Peterson died instantly. The plane impacted the earth at 170 miles per hour, hitting wing first and sending the plane into a cartwheeling 540-foot spiral across the field. The 3 music icons had been thrown from the plane. The pilot was found mangled in the wreckage. Buddy Holly's mother was listening to the radio when she heard of her son's death. She screamed and collapsed to the floor. Holly's wife was 2 weeks pregnant when she saw her husband's accident on the news. The psychological trauma experienced that day caused her to have a miscarriage. Since the accident, people have been reporting strange things around the crash site. 3 orbs of light have been seen by many in the exact spot where the bodies were found. Some have heard disembodied voices, screams, and moans coming from the crash site. The sound of a small airplane is often heard when none are flying in the sky. Buddy Holly's ghost is said to haunt the rural gravel roads and has been seen around midnight hitchhiking with his unmistakable black-framed glasses. When passers-by look back in their rearview mirrors, he's gone. Today, a small memorial shows the final resting spot of the 3 musical icons, a solemn reminder of the cold and snowy day that music died. Anna Eklund, The Earling Exorcism, Earling, Iowa. Father Theophilus Riesinger had been ordained for nearly 3 decades as a priest and exorcist. At the request of the church, he was asked to perform an exorcism on a 46-year-old woman afflicted by the forces of evil. Although anonymous, she has come to be known as Anna Eklund. Anna Eklund was a very religious and pious child. She was of good heart and mind. Her parents were German immigrants and raised her in a Catholic household. When Anna was 14, she suddenly found prayer revolting. Every time she tried to pray, she would vomit green bile. She was filled with sick and perverted thoughts and acted upon them without regard. But at the same time, she was conflicted with an urgency to go to church, to pray, but was always met with violent thoughts and actions. Those who witnessed the ordeal said it was almost as if some force was pulling her away and she was fighting it with all of her life. Over the years, she had seen multiple doctors and specialists, but to no avail. Something evil had a hold of her and wasn't letting go. The woman suffered most of her young life, dealing with this unholy affliction. By the time she was 46, she had had enough. With the permission of the church, Anna Eklund headed toward the convent in the cover of the late evening shadows on August 17, 1928. There she met Father Theophilus Riesinger. Almost immediately upon entering the church, Eklund began to display symptoms of possession. She spoke in multiple languages that she had never learned. Her facial expression would twist until she was unrecognizable. Many of the nuns said they could feel the hate radiating from her. She showed signs of impossible strength and supernatural powers. On August 18th, Father Theophilus Riesinger began the first rites of exorcism. Anna was tied down to the bed with leather straps. As the Father invoked the Holy Trinity, Anna Eklund broke the straps, flew from the bed, and levitated in a twisted form in the far corner of the room above a doorway, much to the horror of everyone in the room. People were screaming and a few passed out. But Father Riesinger's battle was just beginning. The first part of the exorcism lasted a grueling and horrific 8 days. Eklund refused to eat and was constantly vomiting up what looked like tobacco leaves. Her health was quickly deteriorating. Her eyes and lips seemed engorged. She no longer looked like Anna Eklund. Her limbs would twist and form in human angles. The sight was so disturbing that many of the nuns witnessing it had to leave the room. In fact, after witnessing the levitation of Anna Eklund, many of the nuns asked to be transferred as far away as possible. On December 23, 1928, at 9 p.m., the room was full of witnesses, the brave nuns that stayed behind, and the priests. After nearly 4 months of violent, self-inflicting war, Anna Eklund broke free from her restraints and floated above the bed. Her body was completely stiff and immovable. As they tried to pull her down, the room shook violently and a tremendous scream came from everywhere all at once. Then, for the first time since she could remember, Anna Eklund began to pray. Tears fell from the faces of everyone in the room. The oppressive feeling left the room, and a shadowy veil that had been hanging over them the past few months had lifted. Anna Eklund lived out the rest of her life peacefully. The case would become the most famous exorcism case recorded, and even inspired the 1971 novel The Exorcist. Although she claims to not have any memory of the exorcism, those who witnessed it would be forever haunted by the evil they encountered on a summer night in Earling, Iowa. The Visitor of Van Meter, Van Meter, Iowa. It was the fall of 1903. Eugene Griffith looked at his watch as he hurriedly walked down Main Street towards his home. It was after 1 a.m, and he had promised his wife he would be home early, but was unable to keep his promise. The cold night air stung his face and pierced through his clothing. He pulled his coat tighter and quickened his pace. Home was only a 10-minute walk from Main Street. The moon was nowhere in sight. Everything was dark. As Griffith walked, he could barely make out the street in front of him, and the buildings cast even darker silhouettes against the night sky. Midway down Main Street, Griffith saw a blinding light atop the roof of the Mather and Greg's building. The beam of light splashed across the street below and into the windows of the buildings across the street. It was searching for something. Griffith was alarmed that he may have caught a thief and called out to thwart the criminal. In response, the light jumped into the air and landed on a building's rooftop further down the street. What the hell was that? Griffith wondered as he walked further down the street toward the light. Whatever it was flew through the air. This was something beyond his understanding, yet he felt it was his civic duty to investigate. Almost directly beneath the roof where the light beamed, Eugene Griffith called out to the intruder again. Again, the ball of light flew into the sky directly above him and landed on a building's roof on the opposite side of the street. Griffith was stunned. Although he had gotten a much better look, he was still unsure of what he was seeing. As he stood there, frozen in amazement, he watched as the light ascended upwards once again and disappeared into the night sky. Eugene Griffith rushed home to tell his wife what he had seen. The next morning, Griffith continued his investigation. He told the business owners of the buildings he had seen the creature on about what he had witnessed the night before. The rooftops were searched, but nothing of interest was found. The following night, around 12:30 a.m., a town's physician, Dr. Alcott, had just fallen asleep in his office chair when he was abruptly awakened by a bright light coming through his window. This spotlight was brighter than anything they could produce in 1903. The doctor jumped out of his chair in fear. Grabbing his pistol, he ran out into the cold autumn night. Around the corner and hanging from the outside of his office window was something unexpected and horrifying. Although it was extremely dark out, the doctor was able to clearly see the creature hanging from the building because the light it produced was reflecting back on it from the window pane. He raised his pistol, hand shaking violently. The creature was black and leathery. It was human-like and yet not, with a wingspan of 9 feet. It was around 9 foot tall and had a long, angular face with a sharp beak the same color as the rest of it. But the most peculiar feature was the stubby horn that protruded from its forehead. The horn emitted an unnatural light. The creature hung from the building by a sharp talon, which extended from the joint of the wing. The doctor was frozen with fear. The sight of the creature was so terrifying that the doctor impulsively squeezed the trigger, firing his pistol at the thing hanging outside his window. To his horror, the doctor was instantly bathed in a blinding light. Although he couldn't see, he knew the creature was staring directly at him. In a panic, the doctor began firing into the light. After 5 shots, the creature shrieked and flew off into the night. The next morning, the town was abuzz with talk of a flying creature that had been seen by 2 of the most prominent men in Van Meter. The population of Van Meter in 1903 was just over 400, and word traveled fast. The community was on edge. By the time night fell upon Van Meter, Clarence Dunn had armed himself with a shotgun and awaited the creature. Dunn was the teller of the Bank of Van Meter, and he felt obligated to watch over the town's financial center. By 1 a.m., Dunn had fallen asleep on the bank floor. A strange noise coming from outside the window startled him awake. Dunn rose to his feet to investigate what was making the gurgling, wet, choking scream he was hearing. As he slowly peered outside, he was suddenly blinded by a bright light. He couldn't make out anything in front of him. He was completely blind. Even bringing his hands up to shield himself from the light did little to help. He was paralyzed and frozen in the glow of the unnatural light. Panicked, he rubbed his eyes. When he opened them, he saw that the light had moved on and was scanning the room. As it scanned from left to right, he could make out the terrifying face and eyes of the black creature that peered into the window. It had soulless dark black eyes that had no reflection in them whatsoever. Not even the intense light coming from its forehead pierced their emptiness. As its head turned, a long, sharp beak pointed downward, but was no less threatening. Sharp teeth ran along the top and bottom of the beak in a staggered formation. As the light began scanning toward him once again, panicked, Dunn fired the shotgun into the thing outside the window. Shattering glass rained along the wooden boards of the bank floor and the street outside. Clarence Dunn was sure he had shot the thing. The bright and blinding light washed over him once again, burning into him this time. Then the light vanished as the winged creature flew off into the cold night. This time, the creature left evidence behind. The next morning, along the dirt road outside the bank window, Dunn found a set of 3-toed footprints. They were massive in size. Plaster casts were taken of the footprints, but have since disappeared and is yet to resurface. The town was ready later that night as darkness fell upon Van Meter. But the night was silent, and many believed Clarence Dunn had shot and killed the creature. People awaited anxiously the next morning for news of a sighting, but there were none. As the day wore on, the town became a little less apprehensive, but their peace would be short-lived. The following night, the creature was seen once again. The local hardware store was owned by hardware merchant O.V. White, and he resided above the hardware store on the 2nd story. He was asleep in his room when he awoke to a strange sound coming from outside. The location of White's hardware store was on Main Street, near the location of the first sighting, so O.V. White was armed and prepared to defend his property. Shotgun loaded, he peered out of his window and into a dark and moonless night. It was dark, but he could see silhouetted against the night sky a large creature perched atop the telegraph pole across the street. Although he couldn't make out any features to its face, he knew the creature was staring at him. He could feel it. His knees shook as the figure unfolded its massive wings. Without thinking, he raised his shotgun and fired at the creature. The commotion awoke Sidney Gregg, who was at his shop down the street. He hurried to see what was causing the commotion. As he ran out his door and into the street, he saw a massive humanoid, bat-winged creature flying directly overhead and towards the old mines. O.V. White was on his hands and knees, choking and gasping for air. White later recalled that as the creature opened its wings, it emitted a foul smell. The intensity of the smell brought White to his knees. By daybreak, the entire town knew of the Van Meter visitor and was on guard. The town armed itself and staked out the old mine at the edge of town. Miners had long been telling the townspeople of strange noises coming from the deepest depths of the mines, but no one believed them until now. 2 guards were posted outside the entrance to the mine, awaiting for signs of the creature. It wasn't long after the first star in the sky appeared that the creature emerged, but it was smaller this time. Then a second larger creature emerged behind it. both flying off into the sky. The guards rushed back to town to awaken the miners and townsmen. They felt something had to be done. Armed with all manner of weapons, the small town of Van Meter set up ambush outside the mine and awaited the return of the creatures. Near dawn, the two creatures returned. Intended on murder, the town gave it their all in an attempt to kill the cryptid creatures, but watched as they disappeared completely unscathed into the darkness below. Using dynamite, the town closed up the entrance to the mine, forever trapping the creature in the dark depths of the earth. Or so they thought. It was almost 80 years when the creature was spotted again. The story had long faded, and not a lot of people talked about or remembered the Van Meter visitor back in 1903. An older gentleman had just moved into the area. He was walking near the coal mines when he saw a giant bat-winged creature flying overhead. In 2006, a pastor was outside when he saw what looked like a dragon in the sky. He quickly Googled Iowa dragon, and the results were the Van Meter visitor. It matched what he had seen. There have been many reports of the cryptid in recent years, reinvigorating the legend from the past. But one can't help but think of the possibility of a subterranean world beneath our feet, filled with fantastic and terrifying beasts.